Hello everyone, it's Olivia Fleury and I'm just going to give you guys an introduction of my topic that I chose for my final essay. So I'm specifically going to be focusing on intergenerational trauma and historical trauma responses in the Indigenous community. So I'm going to be relating that to Tommy Orange's There, and specifically his character Jackie Redfeather. Just because I felt like when I found my source, a lot of the historical trauma responses they speak on is actually very apparent in Jackie's character. So I felt really passionate about this topic. Number one, because I'd say that this was my favorite book I read in this entire semester of all my classes. And the reason for that is just because I felt like there was this rawness and this realness to Tommy Orange's writing. He's not trying to filter anything or tell a happy story. He's trying to get you to think about these real pathologies that are going on in the Indigenous community, and that is not due to them. That is due to lack of support, lack of understanding, and just like some people just don't grasp the concept of intergenerational trauma. So what I mean by that is I feel like my whole life I've heard people spew these very negative stereotypes about Indigenous people, whether it's that they're alcoholics, they're lazy, they're violent, etc., etc. But the truth is that people really don't understand this is intergenerational trauma showing itself to us. So trauma actually rewires your brain. It's not something that's just emotional or mental. It's something that neurologically changes in your brain, and that can be passed down genetically, and that's what shows up as these historical trauma responses that, again, is very apparent in Jackie's character. And so I just really wanted to touch on that because it's very hurtful hearing these stereotypes when people don't understand what's really coming from just lived trauma across generations of these different groups. And so I do think that there is hope that Tommy Orange not only offers, but just that we can offer. In Canada, I think that the hope is really to recognize that this is something that has impacted generations of people, and that we need to be more understanding. We need to combat poverty. We need to combat mental health. We need to combat all of these different issues and recognize that this is a disease. It's actually something that is really hurting people because they just need to be seen and understood. And so, I mean, Tommy Orange speaks on this a little bit, right? He speaks on being connected to this history of Indigenous spirituality. And in that, he says that upon suffering beyond suffering, he's speaking of a prophecy here. Upon suffering beyond suffering, the Red Nation shall rise again, and they will be a blessing to a sick world. And so he speaks about people being interconnected again. And so that means where everyone is accepting of one another and everyone knows that they are one with the earth and one with each other. And that is where we see wholeness and something that can heal, you know, these generations of trauma that have been passed down. And so I actually found a quote that from my secondary source, this is what drew me into it. It was something from a Lakota woman, and she speaks on intergenerational trauma and how she has felt personally impacted by it. And I just felt Jackie in this writing. Like, I felt that this is something that we can see in her character throughout the entire novel. And it is that she speaks on, I feel like I have been carrying around a weight that I have inherited. I have this theory that grief is passed on genetically because it's there, and I never knew where it came from. I feel a sense of responsibility to undo the pain of the past. I can't separate myself from the past and the history and the trauma. It has been paralyzing to us as a group. So that's how this source begins, this academic journal begins, is with this quote from a woman who is actually experiencing this intergenerational trauma. And she explains it as this weight that I didn't know where it came from, but it was always there. I feel like I've inherited this pain. And that's what my source speaks on. So my source speaks on, okay, how does this intergenerational trauma occur? Well, we go all the way back to colonialization, assimilation, residential schools, and then we take it with the modern losses of the community. So that's poverty, that's unemployment, that's mental health issues, that's social and geographical isolation. So whether that's, again, like where they have, remember where Jeff was speaking of the Relocation Act, the Indian Relocation Act, where they're trying to bring them into the cities off their reservations and assimilate them further. So those kind of things is what he's speaking on. So those past losses and then our modern losses are what makes these historical trauma responses. So what are these historical trauma responses? How do they appear? Okay, mental health issues, substance use, physical and sexual violence, loss of child-rearing skills. This is interesting to me. These are what my sources speak on because we see this all in Jackie. And that's where I'm going to get into my paragraphs of what I'm going to build and how we see those historical trauma responses right in Jackie Redfeather. And so my thesis is going to be Tommy Orange's There explores the pathology of intergenerational trauma passed down to Jackie Redfeather from historical losses of land and cultural identity, and the historical trauma responses she faces in her struggle against sexual violence and substance abuse problems. So I want to touch on those. What are these historical trauma responses that we see in Jackie Redfeather? So we see sexual and physical violence for sure. So that's an example of Harvey assaulting her on Alcatraz and her becoming pregnant. You know, like it's very clear that this was not a consensual situation. And they're drinking on the boat. This is where we first see Jackie kind of coming in to her problems with alcohol. And Harvey's also experiencing that and facing that. And that results in the sexual violence that happens to Jackie. Then we also see her adopted uncle Ronald sneaking into her room and pulling at her legs at the end of the night. That's also violence against her, right? What was he trying to do? Then I'm going to go into my second paragraph. Well, we have Jackie's struggle with substance abuse. This is going to be a huge topic because I'm going to go all the way back from her first time with alcohol. Where is she now being 11 days sober in her 60s, right? She's still struggling. She's a substance abuse counselor and she's still struggling. And this is no fault of her own. This is trauma representing itself. And so I really want to speak on that. I want to speak about the conference she goes to, which was for substance abuse and suicide in Native communities. And how does that connect to her life and what she's struggling with, right? I could also, if I need a little bit more to talk about, I have it set aside where I can speak about the loss of child-rearing skills. So, you know, when she's pregnant, she doesn't really have many options of what she can do because she's stuck with, again, her mother has passed away now, and she's stuck with her Uncle Ronald, and she's 18. She doesn't have a lot of options. And then with Jamie, she loses her to, she dies by suicide. Her first daughter, her other daughter, not the one she got pregnant with Harvey, her other daughter. And then that kind of leads to her feeling like she is incapable of caring for her grandchildren. So there's lots of different historical trauma responses that do directly appear in Jackie Redfeather. And I think it's beautiful that Tommy Orange talks about this. And so then my conclusion, this is the possible cure. Okay, so I thought it was so beautiful when Jackie is just going through this crowd of bullets in the stadium, and Orville's been shot, and she's lifting his body and she's carrying him to the other side. And I felt like there's just such a deeper meaning to this, is that the hope is in this next generation. The hope is we, not just Indigenous people, because I think that they already understand that they've been wronged. We need to see what we've done. We need to see how we are still installing this trauma. Again, unemployment, loss of jobs, social and geographical isolation. We need to see that, and we need to care for this next generation. We need to carry them to the other side. And that could be a connectedness to Indigenous spirituality. This could be a connection to the past ancestors. Like Jackie speaks of, she feels this sound from underneath the ground helping her carry Orville. This is the past of generations and generations and generations that have experienced this trauma. And they are pushing for Orville to go forward, to heal this trauma, because that's the beautiful thing. Trauma rewires your brain, but healing and recognizing it also does too. And we are a big part of healing that trauma. And so that's how I want to conclude that there is hope. And that's what Tommy Orange speaks on in carrying Orville out. So I'm really excited about this topic, and thanks for listening to me, guys. If you have any suggestions, please just let me know below. Thank you so much.